Module 1 considered how politics and policy can be understood through 5 different approaches. A 6th approach, however, that was not discussed is the cultural approach. The text treats political culture as part of the environment. 2 other elements of the environment, which might determine the success or failure of a policy, include socioeconomic conditions and geography. Institutions, rules, and policy are one thing, and actual politics is another. That is, seasoned politicians and bureaucrats recognize that there are social and cultural rules that often trump policy rules and laws. For example, when President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and proceeded to brutally remove Native Americans from parts of the South, Chief Justice John Marshall declared Jackson's act unconstitutional. Jackson replied to Marshall, "Stop me." President Jackson knew that the Constitution and the Supreme Court and perhaps the North were against him, but he also knew that the political culture in the South and the economic times were on his side. And so the wretched Indian Removal Act unfortunately succeeded. Since the ancient Greeks, officials have disagreed over how to form public policy. Should the policy be tailored to fit political culture, or should the state change the culture of the people to fit the policy? Plato endorsed the latter. In his dialogue, The Republic, he develops the utopian regime where citizens are made to submit to the system. Those who do not embrace this system, policies, are removed from the city. That is, Plato advocates first creating excellent policies, and second, making the people submit to them by changing the culture of the people. Some federal policy follows this formation of policy. Consider the policy of desegregation of public schools in the 1950s during the wake of Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, 1954 and 1955. At the time, desegregation countered the political culture of the South. The federal government sought to change this culture. Aristotle takes an opposing approach. In his book, The Politics, he argues that citizens should not be made to submit to policies or laws counter to their culture, but rather policies should be tailored to fit the people and the place. For example, a 65-mile-per-hour speed limit makes sense in New York State, but makes little sense in Kansas, which has flat, straight roads and is not densely populated. The United States, compared to most countries, has a system which local policies are emphasized. That is, most policies are state and local policies. When Congress passed a Crime Control Act of 1990, the Supreme Court found one section which stated that public schools K-12 are gun-free zones unconstitutional because it violated the Second Amendment. Not because it violated the Second Amendment, but rather such policy jurisdiction did not belong to the federal government, but rather belonged to the states. Guns for recreation, hunting, and protection are part of the culture for people of some states, and not for people of other states. Policies on gun control, then, are tailored to different states. The solution to governing a large, expansive, diverse country like the United States is to let state governments govern the people. When developing policy, the environment must be considered. A few aspects of the environment includes geographic characteristics, demographics, population, political culture, social structure, class system, and economic system. The effects of most of the characteristics are straightforward. Geographic characteristics will influence transportation policies. Social structures may determine the redistribution of wealth. Demographics might influence social service policies for the young, such as public schools, free lunches, and for the elderly, Medicare and Social Security. There are, however, two characteristics that are not straightforward, namely political culture and economic structure. Researchers have wrestled with the question, what influences what? Do political institutions influence economic growth, such as liberal democracy, democracy with guaranteed rights, lead to economic growth, or does economic development lead to greater democracy? Some, like Max Weber, argue that Protestantism leads to capitalism and a strong economy because of the Protestant work ethic. Weber argues that the Protestant work ethic has become secularized. Others are highly critical of Weber. Thomas R. Dye takes a different position from Weber. He argues that economic development shapes both political systems and policy outcomes, and most of the associations that occurs between system characteristics and policy outcomes can be attributed to the influence of economic development. An economic depressed state cannot afford to provide progressive social programs, despite the great need for such programs. States with more developed economic systems tend to be very progressive. New York has a strong economy compared with other states, and it has very progressive policies. Neither Weber nor Dye has the last word on what drives policies. Indeed, to side with Weber or Dye entails the assumption that politics is deterministic and can be predicted. Politics is very complicated and concerns many variables. Recall, one of the goals of political scientists is to develop simple models. Protestantism leads to a good economy, or well-developed economies have progressive programs that can be easily applied to events.